earlier about some countries don't have good labor laws, and so people get taken advantage of, right? So it's complicated. The last thing I would add that, having resources and turning that resources into wealth requires a lot of organization, a lot of structure, right? Because just having resources in the ground doesn't mean that your country's going to be very wealthy. There's many countries right now that are very rich in resources, but they don't necessarily have that global organization to be able to sell their resources and have good relationships with other countries, or proper infrastructure, proper leadership, and it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for that country to gain wealth. Okay. Afghanistan is a great example of this as well. The Russians in the 70s, they invaded Afghanistan. Part of the reason was because Afghanistan was very rich in resources. That's why they wanted that region of the world as well, right? There's a lot of resources in the ground there. That's also part of why America invaded, Iraq and Afghanistan as well. There's quite a bit of oil in those countries. There's quite a bit of resources, but maybe those countries lack the organization necessary to be able to take those resources out of the ground and sell them, right? So just having a resource doesn't mean that you are going to be wealthy, right? This is kind of an advanced question for you kids, but this is from a book I was reading. And I'll just tell you, it's called The Mystery of Capital. I forget who wrote the book, but he talks about the importance of private property and ownership, which allows people to build wealth, right? So one of the arguments this gentleman makes in the book is that the reason why a lot of people in third world countries, or there's a more politically correct way to say that now, developing countries, that would be the phrase. The reason why people in countries that are developing aren't able to gain wealth is because they don't have a proper track record of who owns the property. So, for example, some of you, your families have been here for a long time. Perhaps your family owns some land, a cabin, or your house that you live in, right? And you can, go to the bank and verify that you own that property. So when your parents die, maybe they'll leave the house for you or one of your siblings, or they'll split it amongst the siblings, and that wealth is transferred on to you. In many countries around the world, they don't have that same relationship, right? So a bank might say, well, we know this house exists, but we have 3 people here. It says 3 people own this property. They're all saying that they own it and not the other person. And so a lot of that wealth is then locked up, right? That's kind of the argument he was making. For why some countries and citizens aren't able to succeed financially, because they don't know who owns any of the property, any of the wealth, and then from there it's hard to build up, right? Like think about it this way, right? Part of the reason why homeless people struggle, I mean, there's a variety of reasons, but part of the reason why they would struggle is because, what's one of the first things a workplace asks you? They'll ask where you live. Do you have an address? And if you don't have an address, if you're at 0, it's hard to build up, right? So similar situation, if the government doesn't know who owns things, if people don't know who owns things, they can't build up from there, right? Because perhaps no one owns it, right? It's complicated. Now we're shifting on into some more of the textbook stuff. So some of these thinkers, Mr. Olson mentioned, so your textbook talks about this guy, John Maynard Keynes. He's not actually in your curriculum for grade 10, but Mr. Olson confirmed with me that in grade 12 you do talk about this gentleman and his politics. But just to briefly go into this, so grade 10 will start to develop your understanding of economics, and in grade 12 you kind of look at that in the bigger picture, more specifically. But part of the responses are, so John Maynard Keynes, he's more on the economic and political left. What he believes is that government intervention is necessary into numerous aspects of the economy. So what that means is that when things aren't going well, the government should step in. I believe he essentially advocated for printing money and just adding more money into the economy to stimulate spending and growth, so that the economy can grow, right? And we'll look at some other thinkers who think differently. But Some of his beliefs there include that falling wages, so if you're making less money, you spend less money, okay, which kind of makes sense, which means you have less economic activity, which is bad for the economy, right? So this is supply and demand, right? If you don't have enough money to buy things, you're not going to buy things, right? And you're definitely not going to buy, extra stuff to stimulate the economy. And so he believes that the government needs to directly act in order to prevent or lift itself out of recession, which is negative economic activity. That's a bit of a complicated concept sometimes to understand, through an increase in total spending. Okay, so generally speaking, Keynes is an ardent supporter of government intervention and government being the solution out of crisis. So he really thinks that you should just trust the government. You should let the government lift you out of that economic recession and let the government solve your problems, right? And many people are going to differ and vary on that note. That's why he's on the left of the spectrum, okay? We'll skip over those questions. Okay. Next up, we have Friedrich Hayek. He is a little bit on the opposite side. He is against this idea of central planning, against this idea of government intervention. The reason for that, so there's a particular reason why I put their the years they were alive. It's important to note that prior to 1946, or by 1946, the world didn't really fully understand, or were aware of what happened in communist Russia, in the USSR. Also, the communists hadn't really taken over China by this time either. So John Maynard Keynes' ideas make a lot of sense when you don't see how full totalitarian government control can go really poorly. Hayek, on the other hand, he died in 1992, so he pretty much saw the fall of the Soviet Union, but he saw more of the lifespan of Soviet Russia, what communism did to Russia, because that's from about like 1917 to 1980s or 90s, somewhere around there. But Hayek is on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? So Keynes is way, this is left for you guys. Keynes is way on the left, put it in the hands of the government. Hayek is pretty much opposite. He's somewhere around here, right? He wanted little to no government intervention into the economy. He was against this idea of central planning. That's a concept you'll learn more about in grade 12 when you look at ideologies. Centralization, central planning is something you'll need to know for grade 12. But it's the idea that the government plans out economical decisions, amongst others, for the decision. That's central planning, and he's against that, right? What's up? Hayek is a supporter of freedom, free societies, and free individuals, right? So he doesn't want the government influencing and getting into people's lives. Much of his criticisms come from observing totalitarian attempts at creating utopian states, right? So the Nazis, the communists, a number of different ideological beliefs, they wanted to create this utopia state, this perfect state. The Nazis were very against certain groups, and so their utopian state involved genociding a particular group, killing them en masse. The communists, on the other hand, they're very against people who are opposed to their ideas, right? So for example, and I've mentioned this before, a friend of mine, Tony Chin, wrote a book called Freedom Swimmers, where he documents and details his mother's escape from communist China, where she literally swam 8 to 10 hours overnight, fleeing China. But the system in communism, what essentially happened in Russia and China was that the small group of people in the government who were in charge gained the control of the entire country, and then from there they just made decisions on everyone's behalf. So in Russia, a lot of what was seen is that they took out, and you'll learn more about this in grade 12, they took the richest farmers, the wealthiest farmers who were really good at farming, and likely made their wealth not because they were corrupt, but because they were good at producing food. They took their land from them, and then redistributed amongst the lower classes of farmers, which then produced a famine. And then Stalin, who was in charge of Russia, one of the things he thought was that the Ukrainians were holding out against this communist idea, so he starved them out forcibly because they had the control over the entire way the economy functioned and the government system functioned. And that resulted in the Holodomor, which resulted in the death of, or the mass starvation of about 10 million Ukrainians. One of the things that Mao Zedong did in China was, there was a lot of famines there as well. This guy wrote a book called Tombstone, and in which he kind of documents how you can just take a seat. In numerous cases, people who were deemed unworthy or too old or unproductive just were not given food, right? And so in his book, Tony Chin writes from his mother's experience that when things started out, it was great. There was a lot of surplus, so the government would give plenty of food to everyone. But within 5-10 years, with the organization of the country going very badly and a lot of famine, there just wasn't enough food to go around, and millions of people starved to death, right? So in communist China, about 50 million people died in about a 10-15 year period. In communist Russia, they killed probably 30 to 40 million people as well. So, from there you can start to understand why this individual is very against this idea of giving control to the government and letting the government solve your problems, because in his lifetime he saw 2 states completely crumble and millions of people die due to giving full control of the government, right? So that's why he believes what he believes, and that's why he acts more or less in a way that